Hello and welcome to Archives Live Whitechapel. My name is Jenny Draper and today we are going to be exploring documents from Victorian Whitechapel to see what we can find out about the lives of people who migrated to this part of London in the 19th century. You're joining me live from the National Archives in London. It is a treasure trove full of historical documents from the last 1,000 years. From the Domesday Book to the passenger list from the Empire Windrush ship and social media messages from Downing Street. This is the government's official archive, meaning there's a lot of documents about kings and queens and people in power, but you will also find lots of extraordinary records documenting the lives of ordinary people like you and me. These documents can give us a fascinating insight into what Whitechapel was like in the 1800s. To help us with that, we are going to be joined by some expert guests later on, and you'll have the opportunity to ask them some questions at the end of today's event. All you need to do is submit your questions on our Slido using the link or QR code, which is on your screens now. But before we do that, what sort of place was Whitechapel in the east of London? And why did it become a home to so many migrants in the Victorian era? Here's the National Archives 19th century records specialist, Joe, to tell us more.
Whitechapel is an area in the east end of London which sits on an old Roman road, linking Roman Londinium, London, with the capital of Roman Britain, Camulodunum, now Colchester, in Essex. As London developed and its population grew over the centuries, people needed products and services. Whitechapel was located outside the Roman city walls. Therefore, the area was used for starting industries like tanneries, foundries, and breweries, all things that Londoners needed, but which were often smelly, loud, and potentially dangerous. Over time, these businesses grew, and so Whitechapel became a hub of workers and craftspeople, developing a reputation of opportunity for those seeking employment. There were several notable waves of migration to the area. In the 16th and 17th century, over 13,000 French Huguenots settled in the area around Whitechapel, fleeing Louis XIV and seeking refuge from persecution on the continent. They notably created a successful silk weaving industry in Spitalfields. From the 1840s, following the Great Famine, Irish migrants started settling in Whitechapel, and from the 1880s, Russian Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe settled in the area too. By the 1880s, the area was so densely populated that it was home to more than triple the average people per acre when compared to the rest of London. This led to problems with overcrowding, a shortage of decent housing, sanitation issues, disease and crime. There was casual work available to migrants at the nearby docklands. The emerging railways made Tower Hamlets a powerhouse of production and trade for the country and the wider empire, with larger factories and complex chemicals driving even more unhealthy conditions for its occupants and workers. At the National Archives, we hold a variety of documents that can tell us what life was like in Whitechapel and its long history of immigration and industry, such as maps, plans, government reports, and the Census, a head count of the people in each household across the country, taken around every 10 years. The Census can tell us the names, ages, and jobs of people and where they lived. It can even tell us where they were born, which can be very useful when exploring migration to the area. But there is also a lot of information that the Census can't tell us. What was day-to-day like for people living in Whitechapel? Did people enjoy living there and have a sense of community around them? Some of these answers will be lost to time, but some can be found in other documents, as we will find out today.
Thank you, Joe. It's easy to talk about waves of migration and people getting lost in the overcrowding and dangers of the city, but how can we really find out about the actual people themselves? How much evidence still exists about these everyday people from the past? There are so many stories we could explore from Victorian Whitechapel, but this one starts a little further away. The first record at the National Archives that we have of Alexander H. Munro is this census record from 1881, and it shows him staying at the St George Inn in Rochester in Kent, and he's 30 years old, and it says his birthplace is listed as Jamaica. Victorian typo there. He's obviously from Jamaica. And his profession is listed as a mariner, so a sailor. We don't know how long he'd been in England at this point or how long he was planning to stay, but we do think he was boxing in England from 1880. While we don't know much about Alec's early life in Jamaica, he would have grown up in a new age of emancipation in the Caribbean. The abolition of slavery within the British Empire was announced in 1833, though full freedom was not granted until 1838. The post-slavery days were difficult and left decades of low crop prices, droughts, crop failures and disease in their wake. This led to social unrest and an increased British colonial presence on the island. As a result of this and the jobs offered elsewhere, some recently liberated enslaved people and their descendants used their newfound freedom to migrate to other parts of the empire, including Britain itself. Soon, port towns all over England and Wales had Caribbean communities. We don't know for certain when Alec moved to London, but later newspapers say he'd already been in the country for over a decade by the time of the census. Articles from the Times suggest he was doing both bare-knuckle and gloved fighting in the area by the late 1870s, most likely training with former boxing champion Jem Mace. There were many boys and men involved in boxing who were newly arrived in London from the Caribbean, like Alec Munro and Hezekiah Moscow. Others were African-American or first-generation Irish or Jewish, and lots of men who had moved down perhaps from the north of England in search of work. Others were born and raised in the East End, and the vast majority came from poor to very poor backgrounds. Boxing has long been attractive for men from the lower classes, and the East End, the poorest part of the city, naturally became its home. Boxing is accessible. You don't need much except your fists and a pub back room to take part. And it offers the opportunity, if you work hard, to earn money and to perhaps be socially mobile. As well as boxing, Alec also worked as a cab driver, and this is the 1880s, so a cab is a carriage and horses, for Bill Richardson, the owner of the Blue Anchor pub in Spitalfields, which was at the centre of a boxing circuit. Despite its reputation as the headquarters of the East London boxing world, George Duckworth, an assessor for Charles Booth's poverty map, describes the Blue Anchor and the streets around it as a meeting place for thieves. It may have been a generalisation, but there was certainly some truth to it. It was really common for boxers to have burglary and assault convictions. Alcohol-fuelled violence also comes up time and time again. These were tough men in a tough place living tough lives, and they sought alcohol to help deal with it. Sadly, in many cases, it ultimately made things worse. I'm here with Sarah Elizabeth Cox, who's been studying what happened to Alec on the night of the 5th of September 1885, and she's brought some lovely documents here for us to have a look at. What do these tell us?
So what we've got here are the depositions or the witness statements from the men who were gathered in the common kitchen of a lodging house on Little Pearl Street on the night of the 5th of September. What happens depends on which of the witness statements you read. The gist of it is Alec comes home roaring drunk. He has had some kind of argument with some men outside, and he comes into the lodging house and he says something along the lines of, "You dirty dogs."
So he's pretty angry.
He's pretty angry.
And so does he get into a fight with one of them?
Thomas Hewington is sitting at the table in the kitchen, and he's got a large knife and he's cutting up some tobacco, it says here. And according to one witness, Alec was stumbling around and he fell on Hewington's knife.
Okay, interesting.
One of the others says that Hewington jumped up in response to Alec saying Englishmen are dirty dogs, and he swiped at him with a knife. Another says he sort of backhanded him with a knife. The wound doesn't seem that bad. It looks like a bit of a scratch, I think one of the witnesses says.
Oh, okay. So he's going to be all right?
He goes upstairs and goes to bed. And so I don't think Alec thinks it's that serious either. A little while later, he comes back down. He realises he has to go to hospital.
It says here, I assisted the last witness to take him to the hospital.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. He's getting some medical treatment.
He's taken to the London Hospital, now the Royal London Hospital, by one of these men. And this is very late on a Saturday night. We have witness statements here from a surgeon and from Charlotte Goodwin, who's a nurse at the London Hospital. And she sees Alec and still awake. The police do not come and speak to Alec.
Does that say something about how the police were acting in Whitechapel back then and how they were viewed by the locals?
I think so. This is 1885. Things like forensic science, evidence gathering, witness statements. No one even spoke to the victim, to Alec.
It seems like a massive oversight, right?
Yeah. These policing techniques are all in their infancy. The police itself is mired in corruption and they are overstretched as well. Whitechapel is full of criminality and they're just out of their depth. Frederick Geringer, the landlord, in his statement, he says that I did not call the police. I did not know that I ought.
Wow.
Which seems a bit of a strange thing to say.
So was that just a normal occurrence for him in his property?
Geringer is a little bit of a shady character. We know from later on in the 1800s, the early 1900s, he gets into a lot of trouble for overcrowding his lodging houses. He owns lots of different property. He's packed people in to get as much money as he can.
So he doesn't want the police coming around in case they find anything dodgy about him.
About him, perhaps. Right. I think also he might not have taken the situation too seriously at this point. He is probably well used to seeing young men drunk in his lodging house having arguments. Alec dies at 4 o'clock on the Monday morning, so he's been in the hospital for sort of a day and a half. He dies from infection of the wound.
Thomas then arrested.
Hewington's arrested. He admits to it. He says that he did it. He says it was an accident. He didn't mean to, but he did it.
Is there a trial?
Yeah, he's brought to trial. The witnesses give their statements. They all agree that it happened and they all agree that Thomas Hewington did it. He is then found not guilty of manslaughter.
Do you think he was not guilty?
I think he did it. There's not a rationale, there's no explanation given.
Why might they have decided it that way?
I think part of it is to do with the worth that is placed on the life of Alec. He is a black man, a migrant from Jamaica. He is poor, he's single, he's living in a common lodging house. I don't think his death is really considered, it's not taken seriously. Hewington's let go. He goes back to live in Whitechapel. He's kind of a petty criminal, I would describe him as. 8 years later, he's arrested again alongside Thomas McCarthy for robbing an ice cream seller. And McCarthy is sentenced to 12 months in prison and Hewington for 6 months in prison for stealing a few shillings from an ice cream seller.
Wow. So they got more of a prison sentence for stealing a couple of coins than for killing Alec Munro.
Yeah, than for stealing a life.
But the story doesn't end there. Alec's friend, Hezekiah Moscow, refused to let his mentor be forgotten, and Sarah went to the British Library to see some newspaper reports on the subject.
Here we've got a copy of the Illustrated Police News dated from Saturday, October 10th, 1885, about a month after Alec's death. And here on the front page, amongst all these sensational stories, we can see a cartoon depiction of Alec's murder by Thomas Hewington. Underneath it says the alleged murder of a lion tamer. Now, in all the years I've been researching Alec, I'm yet to find any evidence that he was actually a lion tamer. It makes for a bit more of a sensational story. Other reports just have him as a pugilist or a boxer. We do know that Alec's friend and pupil, Hezekiah Moscow, was also an animal tamer, working with bears, lions, a wolf and a hyena at the East London Aquarium. So we're not quite sure whether Alec actually was a lion tamer or if this is just done really to sell copies and make it more of an exciting story. Reports of Alec's death and his funeral appeared in newspapers up and down the country, and here we've got a Welsh newspaper, the Flintshire Observer, and a report of his funeral. It says here that 20,000 people lined the streets to watch the funeral procession to Manor Park Cemetery in Ilford. That's a huge number of people. It might be a slight exaggeration. Why was Alec so popular? I'm still not quite sure. Other reports suggest he was just a bit of a character. He was really well liked. He trained lots of other boxers. He was very well known in the community. What's really interesting here is that Alec was poor. He was a migrant. He was single. He lived in a common lodging house. And yet he gets this large funeral and he gets a gravestone, a really expensive item at the time. His gravestone can still be seen today. That happened because his friend and his pupil, Hezekiah Moscow, organised for the Professional Boxers Association to fundraise, and lots of men put in some money and they raised money for Alec's funeral. I think that goes to show that at this time, black men in London, even in a melting pot like East London, would certainly have faced some discrimination and racism. outside of the boxing ring. Within the boxing community, if they were well liked, well respected, and if they were good fighters in the ring, they were respected and they were part of what they called a pugilistic fraternity.
Apologies if you had a glitch in the feed there. Thank you for bearing with us. Alec's story is a sad example of the dangers of living in Whitechapel at the time and the lack of real policing to bring his killer to justice. But the efforts of his friend, Hezekiah, and his boxing brothers have allowed his name to live on for researchers like Sarah to discover. Sarah will be with us later for our Q&A, so if you have any questions about Alec, Hezekiah, or the Victorian boxing circuit, don't forget you can submit them using our Slido at the link on the screen. We're now going to explore our second story about 19th century migration to Whitechapel. One of the most useful documents is the census. We talked about it a little earlier, but as a reminder, it is a snapshot of the population taken by the government every 10 years. The 1881 census for parts of East London, for example, shows us that many people were concentrated in a relatively small number of houses. I've got a little bit of a challenge for you. If you or your teachers take another look at Slido, you should be able to see the Census Challenge activity for you to take part. We looked at Alec's census entry from Rochester in Kent earlier, but let's take a look at one from Whitechapel now. We're going to start by looking at a page from the 1881 census. It will appear on the screen in a moment, but you can also find it in your resource pack, Census Activity 1. It shows an area in East London called Gloucestershire Court. You'll find details about names, ages, addresses, and jobs. You'll also see a column on the right-hand side referring to people's disabilities, using terminology which is now considered offensive and no longer used on census records. However, it highlights how people with poor mental health or learning disabilities were treated by society at this time. You have 30 seconds to examine it and see what you can find out about the people living there. You can send in your answers to let us know what you find. We can see so many great responses coming through about the census record. You may have noticed the jobs people did, such as dock labourer or matchmaker. You may also have noticed that people such as Patrick and Elizabeth Driscoll were born in counties Cork and Kerry in Ireland. Here to tell us more about the lives of the people listed on this census, we have our 19th century record specialist, Joe Couzens, and Irish historian, Breda Corish.
Hi Breda, thanks for joining me. We've got a lovely example here of a census book with lots of Irish surnames and Irish place names. This census is from 1881. Can you give us a bit of background in terms of the relationship between Britain and Ireland in the 19th century and why we might be finding lots of Irish people living here in Britain?
So what we have to begin with is the 1801 Act of Union. So that created the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland. For the first time, Ireland was being governed directly from Westminster. But 19th century Ireland was also the product of previous centuries of English conquest and colonisation. So that meant, while the majority of the population was Catholic, most of the land was owned by landlords who came from the Protestant minority. It also meant that people had always been moving from Ireland to Britain. But there was a massive increase in the middle of the 19th century because of the Great Famine, or as we say in the Irish language, An Gcirta Mór, and that translates as the Great Hunger. This began in 1845. All across Northern Europe, potato plants were attacked by a new disease called blight, but its impact was the worst in Ireland. 1/3 of the Irish population were so poor they had very little to eat other than the potatoes which they could grow on small plots of land, but for which they still had to pay rent to their landlords. We can see here how some British newspapers reported the unfolding catastrophe in 1847. This image comes from the Illustrated London News. it shows Skibbereen in County Cork. We can see a group of men are carrying a coffin up the street. But the text tells us that inside these houses, the dying, the living and the dead were all lying together on the floor. And all the while people were starving, food was still being exported from Ireland, mainly to Britain, for sale. In the end, about 1 million people died from sickness and starvation, and another 2 million had little choice but to emigrate to North America and, as we see, to Britain.
And so why might Irish families come to the East End of London?
Irish people had actually been settling in Whitechapel since at least the beginning of the 17th century. And then in the 19th century, cheap tickets were available on steamships. New migrants could join long-established working-class Irish communities who often were clustered together in certain streets. They were living in cheap, overcrowded lodging houses and rented rooms. But the benefit was you became part of a community that shared an Irish culture, language, and usually the Catholic religion. And really importantly, these community connections made it easier for new arrivals to find work.
And so one of the things that's great about the census is it tells us about occupations. So what sort of work would Irish people typically be finding, particularly in the East End?
So it is important to note that there was a small minority of very well-educated Irish people. And we often find them working in law, journalism, medicine. But for the majority, they were looking at unskilled work. They, of course, were also competing with the English for work, so they weren't necessarily always made to feel very welcome. Sadly, discrimination was widespread, and that wasn't just against the Irish, but against Catholics in general. Now, these are very old stereotypes, and we know we can trace back their origins to centuries earlier and the original English conquest of Ireland. Then the native Gaelic Irish were described as inferior and uncivilised. But saying that, certain 19th century employers did want Irish workers. So we can see Patrick Driscoll was a dock labourer, like many Irish men. Many others were general labourers. So they worked in construction and transportation. These were often casual jobs. So that meant there was no guarantee of work from one day to the next. And that was a problem also experienced by many Irish women who worked in domestic cleaning. They were known as charwomen. But women and men both worked in factories as well. So if we go back to the Driscoll family, we can see Elizabeth, Patrick's wife, is a lead worker. So that meant she was working with a poisonous chemical, lead, and that was used for making paint and decorating pottery. We also see their 17-year-old daughter, Catherine, was a match worker. And what we know is that her younger sisters, Mary and Margaret, would grow up to become match workers as well. And they ended up working for Bryant and May, who had a huge factory in Bow, east of Whitechapel.
We know that Irish people living in Britain also got involved in political causes. So could you say something about politics at this time?
Many of the London Irish were nationalists, so they supported politicians who were demanding home rule. So that meant that Ireland should have its own parliament while still being part of the UK. Some were Republicans. They wanted Ireland to be completely independent. Some did support the revolutionary Irish-American group, the Fenian Brotherhood. But there was widespread horror within the Irish community at the Fenian bombing campaign, and that culminated in Dynamite Saturday in 1885. Now, at the same time, the Westminster government was suppressing tenant farmers in Ireland. And in fact, the London Irish and English socialists, they were protesting together in Trafalgar Square when they were all attacked by the police on Bloody Sunday in 1887. And of course, there was Labour politics. So we know that the Irish were central to the famous dock strike of 1889. But thanks to the work of historian Louise Raw, we also know now that they were also central to the matchworkers' strike of 1888.
In terms of the matchwomen's strike, can you tell us something a little bit about the causes of that dispute?
So, the key issue was that the company, Bryant and May, was increasing its profits by exploiting their largely female workforce. They paid them badly, but they reduced their pay even more by issuing unfair fines. And that could be for anything from having dirty feet to just talking too much. And the factory was a dangerous place to work.
We can see that here, can't we, in this illustrated London news source, where we can see, as you say, a largely female workforce working very closely with chemicals.
Exactly. And we can also see there are various pieces of machinery being used. We know that one woman adjusted the settings on her machine to make it safer, but she was punished for it. The machine was put back as it was, and 2 weeks later, it cut the finger off one of the women. And then she was immediately sacked. There was no sick pay, there was no compensation. But what the match women feared the most was called phossy jaw. Phossy jaw was a horrific form of poisoning caused by a chemical, white phosphorus, and that was used to make the tips of the matches. And the workers were actually exposed to this all the time. Initially, it made you feel a bit sick, it gave you toothache, but if you were exposed to it for too long, your entire lower jaw would rot away and you could die. Bryant and May knew there were safer chemicals available, but they kept using white phosphorus because it was cheaper.
So what happened during the strike?
On the 2nd of July, 1888, Bryant and May sacked one of their workers, and 1,400 of her co-workers walked out in protest. Now, we have to jump back 2 weeks. Then, some of the matchwomen met with a campaigning journalist called Annie Besant, and she wrote an expose of the appalling factory conditions. And when the owners of Bryant and May read this, they were furious. They tried to force the matchwomen to say the article is a lie. And they identified ringleaders within the workforce, including Margaret Driscoll. But the workforce, they stood up to this intimidation and they walked out. And then they picketed the factory. They held mass meetings. There were daily marches through the streets of London. They met with MPs and trade unionists, but crucially, they secured enough public donations to have a strike fund so that they could live on that while they weren't working.
So this is quite a long-running strike and one that gets a lot of press attention. Am I right in thinking that Annie Besant is behind all of this then, and she's the one driving this forward?
For a long time, many historians assumed that was the case, because Annie Besant was a very well-known middle-class campaigner for women's rights. And the matchwomen, well, they were only poor working-class girls from that bad part of London known as the East End. But the work of historian Louise Raw has shown that historical interpretation was wrong. Annie Besant did play an important role in publicity and fundraising, but it was the matchwomen who led their own strike. And there's this wonderful photograph of the Matchworkers Strike Committee, and in it we see Annie Besant in the middle, but there are two of the women standing beside her, almost certainly Mary and Margaret Driscoll that we saw in the 1881 census. And the other thing that Louise Raw found out was over 3/4 of the women on the strike committee and Annie Besant were all of Irish heritage.
So after building all of this momentum, what happens in the end of this strike?
3 weeks later, Bryant and May give in to the matchwomen's demands. They want the sacked workers reinstated, no more fines, and they want a safe place to eat. Bryant and May did keep using white phosphorus for another 13 years. But this was the very first time that a group of unskilled workers in London had won better paying conditions through going on strike. For me, the greatest legacy of the matchwomen's strike is that it demonstrates how poor working class Irish migrants could overcome discrimination and inequality to change the world for the better.
Thanks, Breda and Joe. Breda will also be joining us a little later for our Q&A, so don't forget to submit your questions on Slido. We're now going to explore our final story about 19th century migration to Whitechapel. Like before, we're going to begin with the census. I bet you're experts at this now. You will see it appear on your screen, but you can also find it in your resource pack, Census Activity 2. This census is also from 1881, and it shows us the people who lived on a street named Crispin Street in Whitechapel. You have 30 seconds to investigate it and see what you can find out about the people living there. Well done. So what did you spot? Living at number 4, you may have noticed the Smith family, David and Jessie Smith, and their son, Abraham. Recently, I had a chance to chat to Theo Daniels from the Jewish Museum London, who told me about this family and Jewish migration to the East End. Theo, it's so great to have you here at the National Archives.
Thank you for having me, Jenny.
Now, I'm so excited to be looking at this real census from 1881, and it tells us a little bit about the Smith family, doesn't it?
Yes, so if you look here, you can see that David Smith is listed as the head of the household, and he was a butcher.
Oh my gosh, and it even says how many people he's employed. 3 men, 1 boy. He must have been very proud of having a 4-man business. What else does it tell us about them?
The census records are useful for telling us about migration to an area. Now, in 1881, they didn't tell us anything about ethnicity or religion, but they did record where people were born. So we can see that the Smith family were all born in Poland. And this little dough sign, that stands for ditto, so it's the same as the above.
Ah, right, so they were all born in Poland. Would that have been usual for the time, for a whole family to have come from Poland?
Yeah, so the Smiths came to the UK at the start of a period of mass migration of Jewish Eastern European families. This was the kind of second half of the 19th century, and it culminated in a period we call the Great Migration, which was kind of 1880 to 1914. By the end of this period, 150,000 Jewish people had settled in the UK.
Wow.
And when we think about migration, we try to think about it in terms of push and pull factors. So push, the reasons people leave where they're currently living, and pull, the reasons why they end up where they end up. And at the time, Jewish families in Eastern Europe were facing extreme economic hardship and also a lot of anti-Semitic persecution and violence, which meant it was no longer safe to stay in their home countries. And anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish hatred. At the same time, a lot of these Jewish families felt pulled to the UK by the promise of economic opportunities. And we've got to remember that these factors must have been really convincing for these families to do a really difficult journey on cramped boats and small trains and leaving everything they ever knew behind, and often members of their family. When the Jewish people arrived in the UK, it wasn't always easy though. Though they weren't facing kind of physical threats of violence like in their home countries, English society was still very anti-Semitic. And in fact, a lot of Jewish families, when they arrived, would change their names, either by choice or by force, to sound less Jewish. And that's how David Schmidt became David Smith when he arrived in 1867.
Oh, I see. So he changed his name. And why do you think they chose Whitechapel in particular to go to?
There's a couple of reasons why Jewish immigrants settled in Whitechapel. The first is purely practical. The arrival point of the migration was the docks in East London, and so it was easy to step off the boats and immediately find shelter in the local area where there was cheap housing. This was especially true for many of the migrants who were treating the UK as a kind of lay-by, a stop-off on their journey to America. And so they would stay local in order to get a ship for the next leg of the journey. Being close to the docks also helped reunite families because, like I said, the journey was hard, it was expensive. Often families would send 1 or 2 people ahead, and then those people would get a job, send money back, and eventually bring the whole family over. And to reunite, it was easy if they stayed local to the arrival point in East London. The other reason is that it just made sense for the Jewish community in London to stay together. The first groups of Jewish migrants, when they arrived, began building the framework needed for the kind of Jewish way of life in the area. Things like synagogues or kosher butchers or Jewish education. And this meant when later migrants arrived, they stayed in the area where they had access to these things they needed for their way of life. As well as this, there was safety and comfort in numbers. Many Jewish migrants longed for the comfort of shared community, shared culture, shared language, because many of them wouldn't have spoken a lot of English. And so it was easier to stay in an area where they could get jobs and live with people who spoke their language in East London. This process was so successful that East London became known for its Jewish population, and we often refer to it as the Jewish East End. Now here we have a map that shows East London in 1899, and you can see the concentration of the Jewish population. These dark blue areas around Whitechapel and Spitalfields show that the community here was 95% to 100% Jewish.
Now I can see you've also brought some objects from the Jewish Museum to show us a little bit about what life would have been like in Whitechapel. And I understand that the Jewish Museum has slightly different rules on how to handle objects, so I am going to put on a pair of gloves to match you.
Yeah, so here I have a booklet from our collection. Have a look.
Okay, so I can see that only a little bit of this is in English at all.
Yeah, so this is a script of a play that would have been performed in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century in East London. Now, if we look up here at the cover, we can see this handwritten note. It says BIS 8347. Now, this likely stood for a telephone number for the area in Whitechapel, Bishopsgate. So if we open it up and have a look inside, we can see that the script is not written in English. It's not even using English letters. And in fact, this script was written and performed in Yiddish. Yiddish is a language that combines Hebrew and German, and it was the primary language of these Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe at the time. This specifically is a script of the Yiddish short opera called Shulamit, written by Abraham Goldfaden. And I actually have also these two music sheets that would have accompanied the performance.
Oh, fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Yiddish theatre would have been like, the scene in the 1880s?
For sure. So Yiddish theatre evolved out of travelling groups in Eastern Europe, and as the Jewish community expanded out of Eastern Europe, they brought it with them, and it became this international cultural phenomenon. So the performers and the artists would travel across the globe, going wherever there was audience demand, and often would become very celebrity-like to the Jewish community in the area they travelled to. One of these famous Yiddish theatre actors was a man called Jacob Adler. When talking about international connections of Yiddish theatre, he said, "If Yiddish theatre was destined to go through its infancy in Russia and in America grew to manhood and success, then London was its school." So we can see that the actors and artists are moving back and forth, following demand, and that a key stage of the development of this art form happened in East London among the immigrant community.
So do you think the Smiths would have gone to see some Yiddish theatre?
Do you know what? I'm 100% sure of it.
Oh.
Because David Smith actually funded the building of the very first purpose-built permanent Yiddish theatre in London at
definitely.
6 Princes Street in Whitechapel. And here you can see one of the programmes from the opening night in 1886. Do you recognise anything?
I can see the title, Shulamit.
Exactly. So the Hebrew Dramatic Club, the Yiddish theatre group in residence at Princes Street Theatre, chose one of the most famous plays in order to build excitement and audience for their opening night. It also shows the celebrity status of their star and one of the leaders of the Hebrew Dramatic Club, Jacob Adler, the actor I mentioned earlier. And actually, this is how we know about David Smith's contribution to Yiddish theatre, because in Adler's memoir, he writes about how David built the theatre for Adler's group as a permanent base of Yiddish theatre in London.
So that's a really unusual thing for a butcher to choose. Why do you think he invested his butching money in theatre?
Yeah, it's a good question. In Jacob's memoir, he described David Smith as a simple, old-fashioned Jew, this Mr. Smith, but how great his love for our theatre. He thrilled with every role I played, overcome with joy at each performance. And we've got to remember that, like many of the Jewish East End, David's first language was probably Yiddish, and he probably wanted entertainment in his mother tongue. And by sharing this experience with a purpose-built theatre, the Jewish population built themselves into a community through shared activities and shared interests. And I also love that David Smith actually made it a kind of family business, because his son Abraham and Abraham's wife Rachel managed the theatre.
So they were all in it together, absolutely. And it makes sense that the Yiddish theatre would be a place for the Jewish community to come together. What happened to that theatre on Princes Street?
Unfortunately, the theatre did not last long. In 1887, there was a tragic accident. Someone shouted fire falsely, resulting in a stampede which killed 17 people. Now, the theatre was deemed safe to reopen, but it kind of scared off the community, and it closed shortly afterwards.
But I presume that Yiddish theatre did carry on in other venues in London?
Absolutely. It had such a large audience in the area that it naturally found a new centre. So after the Princes Street Theatre, the flagship location became the Pavilion Theatre on Whitechapel Road. And I brought with me this reproduction of a poster for Duddy's Fiddle, an original Yiddish play performed at the Pavilion Theatre in 1900. After the Pavilion Theatre, from the 1930s to the 1960s, the centre of Yiddish theatre was the Grand Palais Theatre on Commercial Road in Whitechapel. And here you can see a map showing the different Yiddish theatres located in the East End of London.
So I understand you've got one last thing to show us?
I do.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool.
What do you need to write Yiddish plays and Yiddish operas? A Yiddish typewriter.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the keys here, you can see it's not in English.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, these are Yiddish characters. Absolutely.
Yeah, so this typewriter was actually owned by a writer called Abish Meisels, who was a central figure in Yiddish theatre in the 1940s, and he moved to London in 1938.
Oh, so there would have been actual Yiddish plays written on this very typewriter.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. And what about Yiddish theatre today? Is it still going?
Absolutely. Yiddish theatre's story continues across the globe today. In 2018, there was a Yiddish language production of Fiddler on the Roof off-Broadway in New York, and just last month in September, they did a 2-night revival of it.
Amazing, so you can still see it. Thank you so much for coming and showing us these amazing objects from the Jewish Museum and telling us about Whitechapel in the 1880s.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've loved coming and telling you about one of the Jews of Whitechapel.
If you'd like to learn more about Jewish migration to London, you can visit the Jewish Museum London website. Now it's the time for our live Q&A, a chance for you to ask questions to our expert guests, Breda Corish and Sarah Elizabeth Cox. I'm here with them both, and I'm really excited to hear what questions you've come up with. You've still got a bit of time, so send them in, and please do submit them using the link to Slido on the screen. So our first question comes from Little Heath School, and they would like to know how far language barriers impacted the effectiveness of police and riots that the migrants organised?
So, really interesting question. I'm going to answer it a little bit more generally. We certainly know there's a lot of evidence from that Irish migration that was arriving, particularly in the years after the famine. A lot of people were arriving. They might have only spoken Irish or spoken a little bit of English, and that caused quite a few issues for them interacting with the authorities. Sometimes there were Irish defendants in court, and they really had no idea what was actually going on. And then if we jump forward to the 1880s, so language by then is less of an issue for the Irish, but of course now we have big waves of Jewish migration, and many Jewish people spoke only Yiddish. And that absolutely affected how the police were able to function in Whitechapel and how to interact with the community. And there's a fascinating set of documents here in the archives because it actually shows, in an attempt to overcome that language barrier, the London Met Police actually tried to encourage the police constables to take Yiddish lessons.
Wow, so like as a constable, you would get like a crash course on Yiddish to help.
Exactly, assuming that they took it up.
I see. Thank you very much. This question comes from St Mary's, and this one's for Sarah. They would like to know what drew you to Alec Munro's story when the most famous story from Whitechapel in this period is Jack the Ripper. So what made Alec stand out to you?
Other murders are available, yeah. Alec's story is really, really tragic. I mean, he's young, he's 36 years old when he dies, younger than I am now. And it's just a really sad story. I'm amazed, and given the amount of press coverage it got at the time, I'm amazed that no one had ever picked it up.
There's no books about it.
No one had ever read, researched and written on it before. The other reason I think it's a part of Black history. He's a Caribbean migrant to London. I was in my 30s when I started finding out about Black British history. At school, we learned a little bit about the civil rights struggle in 1960s America, a little bit about the slave trade, absolutely nothing about the 20th or the 19th century in Britain. And it's just really, really interesting for me. And lots of other reasons why as well.
Thank you very much. Now, our next question is from St Catherine's School, and they would like to ask Breda what it would have been like to live in a lodging house. What were these things actually like?
So, short answer, pretty tough. So you have to imagine a lot of common lodging houses began as quite big houses for well-to-do people, and then as the area changed, they were taken over and run as cheaper lodging houses. And that quite often meant the internal walls were taken out. So each floor would be like one giant room with lots of very cheap beds crammed in there. And often multiple people had to sleep in the same bed.
Oh, strangers.
Strangers.
Oh, wow.
Lighting was poor, ventilation was poor. We saw a photograph in one of the videos of there might be a kitchen, but quite often there was very few washing facilities. So, of course, you can imagine it made it much easier for disease and sickness to spread within that environment. At the same time, although they were not pleasant places to be living in, you also have to think about what was the alternative. So if you were very poor and you've just arrived maybe off the boat into Whitechapel, sleeping on the streets, that was not going to be pleasant.
Yeah,
and also
that's your
technically you were
alternative,
committing a crime. You could be arrested as a vagrant. So under those circumstances, the lodging house was somewhere to go. And maybe you would find some sense of community if you're actually staying with people from your own background.
Sure, yeah, you could meet other people who spoke your language, perhaps.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. We've got another question come in for Sarah, and they have heard about a TV series that's based on Alec. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so 1,000 Blows, which aired on Disney Plus in February, is part inspired by my research into Hezekiah Moscow and Alec Munro. The photo that you saw in the video of Hezekiah, we don't have any photos of Alec. I know one must have existed, but that photo is held here at the National Archives. And I was the first person to sort of try and piece together the guy's story. And I wrote about it. It was sort of discovered, and researchers took it to Stephen Knight and created the show, and it documents the kind of turning point in the 1880s of bare knuckle boxing, becoming more moving into professionalism and gentlemen taking more of an interest in professionalizing it. It also looks at a female gang based on the 40 Elephants. It's not accurate.
Of course.
I am the boxing historian on it, and I've kind of helped try and make it historically accurate. But the characters of Moscow and Munro are a fiction. They have the same names and some elements of the background.
It's a fun drama version.
Yeah, season 2 has just been announced for early January next year.
Okay,
it's on its way.
On Disney Plus. Thank you very much. Our next question is for you both, and they would like to know what type of sources you find most useful. Like where do you go first when you're researching these kinds of stories?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the British Newspaper Archive. So digitized copies of all of Britain's history and further afield, actually. Everything's been digitized and scanned. Sometimes the quality is not great. It's hard to read, but there is just this wealth of information there. I use a newspaper called The Sporting Life quite a lot, which covered boxing in London in really, really intimate detail, and then obviously I use things like the census records and birth and marriage and that kind of thing to build the story around the boxes. So their family lives, their personal histories as well.
And Breda, where do you go first?
I would second vote for the British Newspaper Archive and of course the census. But I would also say sometimes we look beyond records. So something I found really helpful to do early on in my research into the Irish in Whitechapel was I made a point of going out to some of the original Catholic cemeteries that opened in London in the middle and late 19th century. And to walk around that environment, and for many people, they had no headstones. They were buried in paupers' graves. But then when you see a large headstone, like the example for Alex Munro, that tells you that some people did have money and they did have status. So it tells you it's a more complicated picture than just that overall impression of poverty that you might get from the official records.
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, take a walk in a graveyard to learn about history. We've got one last question for you folks, and this one is for Breda. They would like to know what impact the Match Girls strike had on other women in employment.
Oh, that is a really great question. The short answer right now, I can't actually bring the specifics to mind, but I would say in a broader sense, this was a really important development in what was called new trade unionism.
Okay.
Because they were deemed to be unskilled workers. And therefore that they made something happen that other people hadn't succeeded in doing before. And now what is coming back to me is then, in the following year, you have the dock strike, which of course is all mainly about a male workforce. But now I am thinking over in Ireland, in Derry, London Derry, in the north of Ireland, there were huge shirt-making factories there, and that was a mainly female workforce. And what is coming back into my memory right now is that there were all sorts of interactions between those two sets of striking activity, between what was going on the docks. I don't know, but they were all. This was all this unskilled labour activism that was all happening the same time, following on in the year or two after the matchwomen strike.
Fantastic. So the matchwomen were kind of pioneers, trailblazers.
They most
for other
certainly
were.
They were extraordinary.
Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for joining us and sending in your brilliant questions. And thank you to my guests, Sarah and Breda. And thank you to Joe and Theo for joining us earlier. Thanks again for watching Archives Live Whitechapel, and we hope to see you again soon.